everybody. And I'd like to sort of start by speaking about this great big lie. We're going to be talking today about our experience in this whole dilemma that we all face, which is what we call do or die disruption, breaking open the great big lie. So this particular statement sort of epitomizes where we are at globally. If you read this statement through, we're talking about job security and stability being in decline. We're talking about a lack of control in the face of uncertainty and the implications of that with mental illness that's permeating society, but not just in the Western countries, all over the world. And finally, looking at anger is increasing and empathy appears to be in decline. Now, if you just think about that in terms of the solutions that people are putting up to us, I think this is a really interesting statement from the World Economic Forum. It talks about reskilling and upskilling through the role of business. It talks about lifelong learning at the personal level, but also then talks about governments providing enabling environments. Now, the question I'd have around that is how much real disruptive innovation or positive disruptive innovation comes out of government and comes out of education, and sometimes even out of organisations when we're working with our people. If I was to ask the question, how much do we think in a hands-up situation of where we see most of our learning come from? Does it come from government? Does it come from education? Now, I won't ask everyone to put their hands up, but when we ask this question in open forums, it generally gets down to less than 30%. So you'd have to ask the question, what happens to the 70%? You have to say that that really is about our own personal realities and responsibilities around our work and what we're prepared to do about it. And you hear us talk about a personal statement, which is, I am strategist. I'd like you to keep that in mind, to write that down. I am strategist. And when you're dealing with your people, be really clear that if we're going to get through this dilemma, it's going to have to happen at the personal level. So if I go back through our experience, we've been doing this work for some 30 to 40 years, whether that be in the early 70s or the 70s, working in the UK, working in Bridgeport, Connecticut only a year ago, looking at the damage that's caused through us not really understanding that we're not going to solve these problems just through government and education. It really takes that I am strategist view to really make sure that we take on personal responsibility. And if I look at this specifically, I track the rise of, say, Trump and Brexit. They're 50 years in the making. If you go back to the 70s and what was happening in the UK and happening in the USA in terms of loss of jobs over a period of time. So a 50-year rollout for a Trump or a Brexit. Now, I'd suggest that 5 years is going to be what's happening here. I don't know if anyone's done pre-voting yet, but you'll get a sense of people's reaction to what government is actually proposing. We've got, when I've pre-voted, there was, the Senate papers about this long. And really what we're dealing with is only a couple of major parties. All of them are extreme left or extreme right alternatives. Very similar to what's been faced in the UK and USA. So that experience sort of tells us that really, the reality of disruption today is that it's happening everywhere. The scope, scale, systemic impact, and also the speed of change, people are finding it very, very hard to keep up. It is just so much information to take in, particularly when you then add skills that need to be attained that don't necessarily relate to the emerging conditions that people are facing. So, what sort of reactions do we get from this? First one we call the Thelma and Louise effect, looking good, going nowhere, where someone's on a trajectory knowing that, you see Thelma and Louise laughing in the car, but knowing at some point they're going over the cliff. It doesn't quite show you the effect of actually hitting the ground. So there's this looking good but going nowhere effect. Then we have what we call managed adaptive decline, where people are iteratively adapting to declining conditions, albeit in a very well managed way. Now, both of these are happening at a personal level and an organisational level. But are we really dealing with what's going on? And this is what we call the lie in the lie. is how many times do we tell ourselves the myths of the future that really we're very comfortable with, but we're not really willing to upset? You know, is education, the education institutions, is government going to solve this problem for us, or can we just rely on organisations doing it for us? We would assert you cannot do that. You have to make people responsible for the realities of what they're dealing with and be able to empower them to make the changes for themselves. So we talk about this idea of a disruption-ready leader. A disruption-ready leader is disruption-aware and ready. They understand we're in a disruptive environment and this isn't going to necessarily change for a long time, particularly for our younger people. Being able to change ahead of change rather than waiting for that change to occur and experiencing the shocks and having to bounce back from those change. And really looking at disruption as something that can be leveraged, something that where we can take those opportunities and really mitigate the risks and understand that we can start to have some sense of control out into the future. Not necessarily predict the future, but really have a methodology where we can understand iteratively what's happening in the emerging conditions and get ahead of that. And lastly, generating authentic, sustainable value. You know, if you think about that idea of authentic and sustainable value, how many of our organisations, how many of our people are really generating authentic, sustainable value? You know, at the end of the day, that's the end game. If you're not doing that, what is the point of doing what you're doing? Authentic, sustainable value generation is the end game. And that's got to last over a long period of time. And that's for a lot of people, or what we're going to have is a Trump or a Brexit moment in Australia at a personal, organisational, government and educational level. Now, you know, we do a lot of work in the USA. I'm going there tonight. And it is a really depressing situation when you go to places that you think are perfect states, as the Americans talk about. I was in England a couple of weeks ago and witnessed the Brexit outcomes. Absolute chaos. That's why we talk about from chaos to competency in terms of leveraging disruption. So if we think about what we're seeing, you know, we do a lot of research in this area. And if you look at the decline that we're experiencing at the moment, 32% of jobs will change significantly due to automation. OECD, 800 million people could be displaced by automation by 2030. These are the sorts of stats that we hear. Now, we actually round this up by saying it's a chaotic environment. No one can really tell what's going on, but there's something happening that most people recognise, and it gets back to that first point of uncertainty and stress. You know, if you go to the States, we went to Columbus, Ohio a couple of years ago, and people are experiencing that in the middle class, the hollowing out of the middle class, because they've lost the certainty of the American dream. So what we're then expecting is that we'll have more jobs created than are lost, technology-enhanced augmented work, this easy job transition, and job replacement keeping pace with displacement. Now, that job displacement and replacement is an issue that we used in my first job. The organisation transitioned me through. You know, when one job was displaced, I got another job in the organisation. That's not happening these days. How we get rid of our flotsam and jetsam, as sometimes it's called, is to get rid of those people and get a whole bunch of new people in. So, but this is the outcomes that were being sold. And we talk about this as the great big lie, the magic box myth. So we have this, you know, this is happening, and then this will happen, and somehow in the middle there's this magic box that solves all these problems. Well, we want to explode that myth, because it's not what is real and accurate. It's not responsible to think that somehow magically we can leave it up to government, up to organisations and up to education. We really have to think about it being up to us as individuals and empowering the individual to take responsibility for the realities of what's going on. Now, that's a view that most people don't take. They'll talk about lifelong learning, but how do you get the individual person to take responsibility about the reality of what's going on? So we talk about this idea of I am strategist. And David's going to talk to this in terms of what you have to do in an organisation or at the individual level. And it gets back to that idea of capability beyond disruption, from chaos to competency, and getting back to this idea of a disruption-ready leader. So I want to leave you with that and pass to David to really talk through how we can make that happen. And we're doing a workshop today that starts to open up those sorts of concepts and ideas in a very, very brief 90-minute session. So I'll now pass to David. Thank you.